A set-piece interview between Prince Andrew and BBC Newsnight presenter Emily Maitlis as recreated in the Netflix hit, which is called Scoop. And joining me now is the author of the book entitled Scoop, executive producer of the Netflix film Scoop, and of course herself, the booker for Newsnight when she landed that scoop, the interview with Prince Andrew for the BBC. Sam McAlister, good morning and welcome.
Good morning. A pleasure to be with you.
Now, it's an extraordinary programme because having seen the interview and squirmed like pretty much the rest of the world, it still has the element of freshness, even though we all know what's going to happen.
Well, what's so extraordinary about it is I was actually in the original interview, of course, with Emily and Andrew. I've now been in the fake interview that we've done for Netflix with Gillian Anderson and Rufus Sewell, and I still feel peril when I'm watching it. Their performances are so brilliant that I'm waiting to hear what he says, and I can't believe when he gives those answers I've heard 100 times, because it's just, yeah, it feels like a thriller almost.
Now, one of the elements of the BBC presentation of this, first of all, it went out on a Saturday night, very unusually for Newsnight, because this was going to be popular television. There is a scene where, before the interview is to be viewed by the viewer, they are walking along together, Emily and the Prince, and they're having a cordial chat and looking at all the grandeur of the palace. But I read in an interview, Gabe, that actually happened after the interview when Prince Andrew imagined that he'd done rather well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in the movie, that's exactly what happens. You get to the end of that interview, and then Gillian Anderson and Rufus Sewell, or Emily and Andrew, go for a tour of the palace. And the pictures that you see, the extraordinary one of them striding down the corridor, Emily and Prince Andrew side by side. He had those photos taken after that extraordinary interview had taken place, and zoom in on his face. He looks pretty happy with the result.
Now, let's go back to the beginning and your position as a booker, a kind of researcher for the guests for BBC Newsnight. In the film, you, played by Billie Piper, brilliantly, I have to say,
Thank you.
you're portrayed as an outsider, a single mom, maybe not quite the typical Newsnight researcher booker.
Absolutely. I mean, I would say I'm a maverick. I think that's a nice spin on it. I veer between extreme passion for the job that I did and sometimes probably being a bit of a pain with that passion. So I certainly dressed as I wished to dress, full black, lip gloss, high heels at all times, said things that I wanted to say. And that was largely welcomed at Newsnight, a group of very receptive people who I worked with, who, were full of good humour and worked incredibly hard, but newsrooms are sometimes tense. And I felt it was only right that we showed some of the nuance of working in a newsroom, particularly as someone who comes from a slightly different background to most of the people you're working with.
Now, portray the time at which the interview is set, the kind of hot water that Prince Andrew was in, and why you discerned that this might be a time when he would talk.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole process actually took 13 months, but of course, we couldn't bore you with that in a movie. But effectively, what happened is over the period of the time that I was dealing with the palace, he went from effectively a forgotten prince, nobody was really talking about him, to a semi forgotten prince, to one of the most talked about people in the world because of the arrest and death of Jeffrey Epstein, and of course, Ghislaine Maxwell being brought in, and the FBI bringing interest in him, and most importantly of all, Virginia Giuffre, who made the allegations against him, which he still strenuously denies, bringing her allegations to the fore over again. So he really started off in cold water. And by the time we got the interview, he was in incredibly hot water. And that was my argument, that the world had not heard from him and they needed to hear from him.
The question of what sort of a person he is. I mean, I don't know how much artistic license was taken in the movie Scoop. I'm sure your book, upon which it's also based, would be rigorous in its depiction of everything. But for example, there's a scene in Prince Andrew's bedrooms where he has all these cuddly toys laid out on his pillow. I mean, is that the way he lives?
So I gather it's actually quite well known in the public domain that he had a penchant for cuddly toys. I can't speak to you. I'm a journalist. You know how this goes. I
Hmm.
can only speak to things I directly experienced. So in my particular situation, I did not go and see those teddies, but I believe they've been quite widely photographed, and there are photos of them in the public domain. But yes, absolutely, an extraordinary scene. where he begins to understand perhaps a little bit the outcome of that interview and how badly it has gone.
Now, with all public figures, there is a persona which they display to the public, and Prince Andrew, in this infamous interview, was trying to display that to his public. But there's also the private person. That private person might be cold, callous, crude, rude, kind, empathetic. What was the Andrew off camera really like?
Well, I mean, you have to take as you find when you're dealing with people in public positions and you're trying to persuade them to come on your program. So he was, all I can speak to is how he was with me. He was exactly as you'd imagine, full of energy, somewhat inappropriate, kind of like in the way he is so enthusiastic in formal settings where most of us would be quite careful about how we're behaving. But ultimately, he is a prince, full of energy and full of smiles, full of laughter, and all of those things, of course, fatal when you're talking in an interview about such serious allegations.
Um, do you believe, therefore, he was completely deluded?
I don't think he was completely deluded. I think he had a misunderstanding about his capacity. Let's be honest, Pat, most people who do an interview think they're going to do a great one. And if you are a member of the royal family who's been told at that stage for 59 years that you are incredible and brilliant, and surrounded by people who tell you that, reportedly the Queen's favourite son, he's had a lot of time being told that he's amazing, and he clearly believed that. So the space between his abilities and his actual capability in that interview and his incapacity to just say sorry were really quite fatal.
Now, as it unfolded, and all these strange answers kept coming out about Tramp and the bar and Tramp, and about Pizza Express, and about not sweating. I mean, I know as someone who has made many television programs, sometimes the interviewer in their head, they keep a straight face, but they're saying, oh, this is TV gold.
Well, I mean, I don't know how Emily managed to do that. I mean, she's obviously such a consummate professional. I was sitting 15 feet behind him. I wasn't conducting the interview. And I have what I call, in those circumstances, a resting producer face, where you must show no human emotion. Inside, of course, I was going crazy, thinking about these answers and the impact they might have. But externally, to all intents and purposes, you're trying so hard to give away any reaction, because that could obviously disrupt things if you eye roll or you show some form of disrespect. So very hard not to show any emotion, poker face all the way.
Now, you present this as a real thriller in the sense that even as the interview is concluding and it's delivered, by motorbike to the BBC, even then, even though it's done, it's in the can, the scoop has been achieved, and the content of it even more remarkable than anyone could have anticipated, there's always the question of the BBC and the palace. Would it be stopped?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I have to be honest with you. I was surprised that it made it to air, not because of any bad behaviour by the BBC or by the palace or any sort of perception of that, but I just thought someone would kind of go, hold on a minute, that didn't go great, and maybe some lawyers would get involved. That would be your kind of natural inference in a situation where something's gone so badly. But never complain, never explain, and it went to air just 2 days after we did that extraordinary interview.
And in the recreation, it is suggested that there was a member of the Queen's staff there, the communication staff of the Queen, who recorded things by on an iPhone or whatever, and murmurs at the end were rather good, or words to that effect. So he was pleased.
Well, that was a different character. He was something, he was representing someone called an equerry. I don't really know how you pronounce it, but a separate member. The gentleman you're referring to was known as Donald McCabe, who worked for the Queen. We use this wonderful phrase, recollections vary. My recollection was that he left the room, and his recollection is that he stayed in the room and recorded the entire interview. So let's go with that. And he certainly was in attendance for some or all of the interview, depending on whose memory is best.
Mhm. Now, the fate of those who were involved in this saga, first of all, we know what happened to Prince Andrew. He stopped all royal duties, he took the back seat, the ultimate back seat, and still remains really in obscurity. But his press advisor, his communications advisor, who is brilliantly played in Scoop, What happened to her?
Yeah, she's played by Keely Hawes. She was a fantastic woman. She was so great to deal with, full of integrity, direct, cool, calm, professional, really a dream to deal with. But when things go wrong, it's always going to be second in command, or 22nd in my case, that takes the fall, sadly. And of course, this went cataclysmically wrong. I don't know who made the final decision. I infer it was him, not her. But of course, when things happen of this nature, she lost her position shortly thereafter.
Now, the cast is absolutely terrific. Rivers Sewell, who plays Andrew, doesn't, he's not made up to look exactly like Andrew, but he kind of captures the essence of the man we saw in that interview. Billy Piper plays you, Gillian Anderson plays Emily Maitlis. Um, does Billy do a good job on you?
Oh my God, it's sensational. I mean, it was so uncanny physically that the crew got us mixed up. And it was so uncanny emotionally, which obviously is important to me as a real person. That all sounds a bit weird when I put it that way, that she got the essence of me. You know, I'm 99% nice, 1% pure steel. And the thing that was most beautiful for me, I mean, I cried when I saw her depicting me on set, was I think she understood that about me, and also how much this mattered to me as a piece of journalism, and to the team and to the other women on the team, the responsibility on us. So her depiction is basically most of my good bits, and she took out a couple of the bad bits.
And Gillian Anderson playing Emily Maitlis, someone who, not unlike Margaret Thatcher, whom she played in The Crown, someone who's still very much with us. That's a challenge.
It's a huge challenge. And Gillian said in the public domain now that she turned this down initially. Billy said yes within seconds because she saw me as an unsung hero. How nice of her to say. But Gillian initially turned it down because she was concerned about playing someone who was still alive. And obviously, she's an icon, Emily Maitlis. What an extraordinary woman. So luckily, they managed to persuade her. And again, a phenomenal performance. Two very similar women, super clever, super brilliant, super iconic.
And I believe the interview was shot continuously as a piece, having been written in several different scenes and done several times, but take one was almost the one.
You're absolutely right. And that was extraordinary because, in a sense, it emulated the interview. With my eyes closed, it felt like it was the real interview. And with my eyes open, it did as well. You know, papers have confused the pictures of them. But they hadn't met on set until that day. So they
Wow.
both walked into the room separately as Emily and as Andrew. They hadn't seen each other in their costumes or their makeup or their prosthetics. And when they sat down, I have to be honest with you, it was a very similar vibe to when we went to the palace that day. There was real jeopardy, real nervousness, and real shock at one another's behavior and reactions. So it was just like the real deal, but just it was in, an air hangar outside of Watford.
Finally, Sam, and there's so much more we could talk about how everything was reconstructed and recreated because, the palace,
Meticulous.
big place and all that. But finally, for you, this must be life changing.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm the luckiest woman alive. No one writes a book that they think their mum is going to read and ends up with a Netflix deal with Billy Piper playing them in a movie about their life. And it's number one on Netflix all around the world, in your good area as well as mine. So, it's a dream come true. I pinch myself, and so lucky for me and my son to have a change of circumstance. So I'm hugely grateful to everyone watching.
Well done, you, Sam. Terrific book, terrific program from Netflix, and the original work by you, absolutely essential and brilliant too. Sam McAlister, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have the green scene next.